All right, we'd like to welcome to the show Dennis Varvaro from Aloft Studios. Can you tell our listeners who you are and what you're here to represent?
Hey guys, this is Dennis Varvaro. As mentioned, I'm from a newly formed startup, Aloft Studio LLC. We were just incorporated somewhere around March 2018, although we've been in informal existence since about 2013, 2014. We've worked on a series of prototypes between that time, and we're actually getting ready to release our first commercial products this year and next year, hopefully. And we're really looking forward to that.
Well, thank you for coming on. And before we dive pretty deeply into Hazelnut Bastille, which, believe me, we're going to do that, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your early gaming memories. Like, when you look back now, what are those first games that inspired you?
Well, those are sort of two different questions. I actually have two very clear early gaming memories, and they couldn't be two more perfect games. My very first gaming memory, I'm probably 3 or 4 years old, and I'm gathered with the family over in Long Island, the outer Islip area. We're over at grandparents' house. My grandfather's making pizza at the time. He's over in the other room. And we're all gathered around the television playing the first Super Mario Brothers. Like, it was actually the experience that Miyamoto pictured. Like, they called it the Famicom, while we were actually having a family experience. There were 4 or 5 of us all gathered around the television together, guiding Mario through the first few levels and failing repeatedly.
It's a classic.
Yeah, it couldn't be more like Norman Rockwell, picture perfect even. And then, could you guess what my second clear gaming memory might be?
I'm going to guess it has something to do with Zelda.
Yes, it does indeed. And it is the original Legend of Zelda. And we're staying with some friends at the time. I'm probably about 5 or 6 years old. Our house had just burned down while we were away. It was some sort of faulty wiring in the stove, and the home wasn't very old at all. I mean, it was just constructed 2 years ago, so it was probably some sort of installation error. But we're all there gathered at my mother's friend's house, and of all things, she just happens to have another Nintendo lying around, and she's giving The Legend of Zelda a go. And we were just, or I mean, me in particular, I was absolutely mystified. It was an entirely different game to any I had experienced heretofore on the NES. I hadn't seen anything like an RPG of any kind, and I was just entranced for the next hour and a half. I really didn't play very much. I mostly just watched my father play, but I mean, from then on, I was pretty much hooked, and I've been under the spell ever since.
Is there any game from the past that you go back to constantly, like maybe one that you have to play through a few times a year just because?
It's probably not anything like that I can recall. I really don't play so many games. I mean, at this point in my life, which is kind of paradoxical. I mean, that as a game developer, you sort of end up just putting all of your heart into your craft, and it demands so much of your time. It's almost like a monastic pursuit, if that makes sense.
It really does. But you've got an artist and architecture background, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what made you
Yeah.
choose that path in life?
To me, it was something that I stumbled upon maybe 16, 17 years old. I had just completed a course in art history in high school, and it wasn't really something that I had a lot of involvement in up to that time, but just the idea of using mathematics and geometry to convey sacred human emotional ideas, the fact that you could create art with just mathematics was extremely captivating to me. And so at that point, I sort of viewed architecture as this lens through which I could practice the science and mathematics and the art and engineering world all at the same time. And that was something that was very important to me. finding a career that I could balance all of my interests with at the same time and never really grow bored with.
Can you tell us how Aloft Studio was formed, like how you met your partners?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. It was probably about 3 or 4 years into my architecture career, and the current firm that I was at more or less had to pack up and leave town. I mean, there was kind of some sort of impropriety going on, but I don't really want to get too far into that. But I mean, the short of it is that firm had to leave the state. And from there, I actually went with one of the past principals who worked there, and we went and we lived in Belgium for a time. I think it was like 3 or 4 months, something like that, over with a famous landscape architecture firm that he had some ties and contact with from earlier in his life. And then from there, after I returned to the States, I mean, I was kind of a free agent. I spent maybe 2 months looking for another firm to jump into. There wasn't really anything biting in the current city I was living in, Charlottesville, which was the famous city in the news just recently. And from there, I started dividing my time between looking for more work and pursuing an amateur game project with friends that I had met online years past. And the more I started working on those projects and prototypes, I mean, the deeper down the rabbit hole I went, to the extent where I was able to start earning money on the level that I was in the architecture world. And I was kind of teetering on the border between two worlds at that point. And I slowly sort of started teetering more toward this direction. I mean, we worked on a series of prototypes, as I mentioned. A person new to development has a lot of barriers against them, especially if they don't have a career directly in the major studios. Now, the person I was working with at the time did. He had a background in Blizzard and Activision, so he was probably the more anchored of the two of us. I had a lot to learn. I mean, I had a lot of background in the same sort of programs and workflow from the architecture world, because a lot of it was common between the two industries. But I had to learn things about how to set realistic expectations in a project, how to have the discipline to see something through, what you can accomplish as a small group of people and what you can't. I mean, what's actually within your financial wherewithal to accomplish. I mean, probably a good 3 or 4 years of working at that before I was in a place where I felt confident that we could actually put something out that was commercial. And we started on a project called Sticks and Starships, which was a project set in a voxel world about the idea of engineering a whole civilization from just the bare bones. The game would be about resource acquisition, material processing, planning out a very complex infrastructure that had sourcing and many levels of manufacturing involved in its whole process. And you would go from the very primitive level all the way up to industrial society and then maybe further on. And it was something that we made a lot of progress with, maybe a year and a half worth. But then the gentleman I was working with at the time sort of had to step away from the project. He had some very pressing family issues. And I worked on a series of solo prototypes from that point forth, maybe 3 or 4 more, while I was waiting for him to come back to that project. And one of those projects actually ended up being viable, and it's the project that you now know as Hazelnut Bastille. And that's the project that we've really been focusing on ever since. In fact, the gentleman I was talking about earlier, working on Sticks and Starships, we're actually reviving that project, and it's been going on in the background as Hazelnut Bastille has been developing. But that's something that we're not really pushing to the forefront. I'm kind of loath to show the public something that might be delayed further, so we really don't show anything anymore that's not on the fast track to being done very quickly. So we really aren't showing very much other than Hazelnut Bastille and Dawnthorn, which is its sister project at this time.
You answered a couple of questions that are coming up already. So,
Oh man, okay.
Where did you end up setting up shop? Like, where's the studio? Is it in Aloft?
Well, that's a little deceiving. It's not a studio in the sense that it's a building that we all visit. I mean, we're all working from home from our home offices. The business is based out of my home office, which is in Virginia Beach, Norfolk area. And the other gentleman that I'm working on this project with, Mark Harbog, he's over in Kansas City right now.
I was gonna ask about what happened to Sticks and Starships, but because you gave us so much on that, all I would ask about it now is, do you think that it will see a significant visual update?
I actually think that it will. I mean, my sensibilities have kind of grown since we started the project, and the visuals to the characters for that project sort of have like this balloon-like sort of bubbly appearance. I'm thinking that I will probably stylize those characters a bit more, maybe to more invoke the sense that they're living in the voxel environment and they have a more clear relationship with the world that they live in. I think that was the biggest problem that I saw with the art style.
It was an interesting thing to do some research and kind of dig deeper on that and find what I could on that game. I'll say that much.
There wasn't a whole lot published about it. In fact, there was a rock, paper, shotgun article on it. And that was just as we were considering running a Kickstarter on that project. But then, I mean, that was pretty close to when the other principal in the project had to move on.
Yeah, I did run into that and found some of that very interesting. I'm kind of hoping that you do revive that project in a sense that you're learning what you're doing from what you're doing now and maybe bringing some more of that into it. But we've kind of avoided this long enough. Let's talk about Hazelnut Bastille a little bit more. So can you tell us how that all began? Like, what really was the spark for that?
So Hazelnut Bastille, I was working on another prototype again at this time, and this is something that sounds funny, but it's something that game developers do all the time. They're playing with these little ideas, these seeds, seeing if they can grow something out of it. Oftentimes these prototypes have some implicit flaw to them. And the project that I was working on at the time is an idea centered around brutalist architecture. The code name for that project was Megastructure. And in fact, that's a project that might get finished in the future. But I mean, who knows? But anyway, at that point, a friend of mine online had mentioned that he wanted to do a summer project before he entered the job world. And I actually suggested something that I had in mind from years ago. I mean, the first Legend of Zelda game is one of the most economical games ever created for the amount of impact it has. I mean, if you look at the tile set, the sprite sheets from that game, all of the animations usually have 2 frames. The entire tile set fits into a 256 times 256 area. I mean, the principles behind the design are so simplistic, but they go so far. So to me, it seems like the lowest of all low-hanging fruits in indie development, in the sense that when you're just starting out, I don't think you should take on a very large project. My opinion of it is that you should probably look for something that you can finish in just 2 months, 5 months, something like that. And I suggested that we take on a project like that for the summer projects. I would take a break from Megastructure, and we would take on a project similar to the first Legend of Zelda. And we did I mean, I'll take responsibility for this. We did something that a lot of studios do in the early days of a project, and we let scope creep get the best of us. And if you're not familiar with that concept, it's something you have in development where you start out with a simple seed of an idea, and it feels like you're in a good place. So you just start adding more interesting features to it. It's an accretional thing. You just started adding more layers. I mean, maybe there's a new mode, and it got to the point where that prototype got out of hands. And it happened very organically and gradually, but at the very least, it got out of hand in a way that we were still able to at least grab hold of. And that's kind of how Hazelnut Bastille developed. It's a 2-month project that became a 3.5-year project. But thankfully, it's still within our grasp to complete.
What made you decide that Kickstarter would give you the platform you needed for funding as opposed to one of the other crowdfunding options like Indiegogo or GoFundMe or something?
Well, there's a lot that's written about that. I think the answers are pretty straightforward and direct. I mean, the biggest thing that Kickstarter has going for it is a sense of urgency, and it's probably a bit of a false concept because I mean there isn't actually the urgency. I mean, a project can be restarted any number of times. I mean, a failure does have consequences, but the concepts that you're pushing is that if the thing doesn't get funded in the time period that you set for it, then you're not going to accomplish your goals as stated. And for us, that actually is realistic in some sense, in that we have a vision for what the project could be in its best state. And we definitely wouldn't be able to accomplish that without the degree of funding that we saw. I mean, not to add another layer to this, but we were seeking something, I think, around $65,000 for the most basic version. And we ended up with something like $177,000, which we were not planning on at all. And after Kickstarter took their share of it, I mean, you have about, I think it was about 155,000 left. I can actually pull up the number here. And we lost, I think, maybe 5,000, 4,000, something around there. And that was due to people stepping away, not being able to actually put forth the money when it was actually time to pay. And that's something that's pretty natural when it happens, because a lot of people are under the impression that you pay when you actually make your pledge, and that's not what happens. You actually end up having the money taken out of your account the day the project finishes. And we had a few major pledges cancel. One of them was the $2,500 tier, but we came away with a very good amount of money. Even so, I mean, it was 157,000 here, looking at the spreadsheet. And I mean, there's so much that this pays for. It pays for our business permits. It pays for our legal fees. It pays for the LLC renewal fees. I mean, we have asset licenses. We have Unity's 2 seats of Unity Plus we have to pay for. I mean, we have quality assurance and the ratings bureaus that we have to go through. And that's more money than you would think. That's probably 5,000, 7,000. We'll have to go through the Nintendo Switch certification process, and that's another 3,500. I mean, there's the Switch development kits. That's an additional 1,000. And then we have some money that's set aside based upon various reward tiers that we have. We have a budget to create the sheet music. We have the budget for the shipping costs for the physical copies that we actually offered. And that's actually a very substantial amount of money, the physical copies. I mean, probably what would surprise most people, if you're not familiar with that, is that you need to buy a very large mandatory minimum for the Nintendo Switch platform. Usually it's 3,000 to 5,000 copies. And those copies aren't cheap. I mean, the kind of card that goes into the Switch, it's probably a few dollars. It's probably $5 or $6 just to manufacture that for the company to break even. And for most of the people who would actually offer those physical copies to be manufactured, they rate them usually between 10 and 15 USD, and multiply that by 5,000 and all the certifications on top of that, and you're looking at $60,000, something like that, just to manufacture for the Switch. And that actually became a very substantial number that was dictating things late in our process that we weren't actually planning on. And that happened because the manufacturing companies were very late in getting back to us. They didn't get back to us until about a month before we actually launched the Kickstarter. I mean, despite us trying numerous times to reach them. And getting that sticker price was a bit of a shocker. You guys probably remember that we had, what was it, a petition that we had just to make sure that we had enough demand in order to offer those as a reward. I mean, we were very worried about that price.
Certainly.
And yeah, so getting back to the original question, though, about why we chose Kickstarter over Indiegogo and the other choices. I mean, there's a sense of urgency. I mean, there's just flat out a much larger market share for Kickstarter. If you look at the amounts of money that you can raise on either platform, usually you see 5 and 6 times the amounts at Kickstarter versus any of the other platforms. And so that was a pretty simple decision point for us.
So I probably going to flip a couple of questions around so we could stay a little bit on this topic, because, you know, your first day of that Kickstarter, you guys came out like a rocket and kind of blew past expectations, right? So what do you think of the pace of the funding as you went throughout the project? And would you say that, I mean, it kind of sounds like in some ways you are, in some ways you aren't, but are you pleased with that final result?
Yeah, I mean, we're absolutely pleased. And I can't picture a world in which you wouldn't be.
Right.
I mean, are you more getting at the why of how that came about, and why we weren't fully, completely surprised it happened? Or
No, just more thinking about the, your thoughts on the pace of that funding. Like I said, I moved a couple of questions around, so this is maybe sounding a little bit out of turn, but it'll make more sense after this answer. I just kind of want to get your thoughts on that pace of the funding throughout at each step of the project.
So basically, if you look at the Kick Track of our project, and for those who aren't familiar, Kick Track is just a tracking service that they have for Kickstarter projects. And it's incredibly useful because you can look at the entire past funding histories for very successful projects, less successful ones, and you can kind of get a baseline for what's natural, what you should expect. And of course, you shouldn't bank upon your hypotheses that you extract from that, but you can learn a lot. And generally, a somewhat successful project like ours will often see what you could call like a reverse bell curve, where you have like a very strong start and a very strong finish. And you're kind of in a bit of a desert in the middle part, which is expected, where you're trying to maintain interest throughout the project. And we had a very strong start, and what I would attribute that to, we had been building our mailing list for a huge amount of time. It might have been, I forget at this point, but it might have been 18 months. And that's one of the biggest things that you're told to focus on the marketing for a Kickstarter. You want as many people on your mailing list as possible. And a good rule of thumb to go by is, if your mailing list is engaged, take the number of people who are actually engaging and reading the mail, divide that by half, and you can expect that amount of people to pledge around $20 or so usually. And another rule of thumb is that you want to accomplish about a third of your funding goal within like the first 5 or 6 days of your project. And combine those two together and you'll have an idea of exactly how many people you need on your mailing list in order to accomplish your goals. And so that was the biggest thing that we used as an index for determining when we were actually ready. And when we hit the point at which we were on track to meet our projection, I think it was maybe 2 months before that we set a tentative date, and then a month before we locked it in. And there's a bit to say about the day that we chose to start and end as well. I mean, there's a bit of literature about this, and what they say is the best days to start and end are Tuesdays and Thursdays. And Tuesday, it's pretty easy to understand why. For whatever reason, it's one of the biggest social media days. Usually Tuesday around noon is when you have the biggest chance to make an impact with something that you post on Reddit or Twitter, any of those social media platforms. And so that's when I think that was our start date, a Tuesday at noon. And other considerations that you really have to look at, you don't want to start anywhere during the month of December at this point of the year, because like a switch flicks in people's head where they're into the mode thinking it's December, I have to spend all the money I plan to spend on Christmas shopping, at least if you're in the Western world with us. You don't want to start your projects near the end of the month or the very beginning of the month, because that's around the time when people have their bills like rent being due, their mortgage, utility bills. So you want to avoid that day. And you want to give a pretty good buffer around any major holidays, because you'll have difficulty competing with Halloween or Thanksgiving or anything like that. And so basically when we made the decision to launch, we only had a few possible viable dates to set for our launch and end date. And we plan to have a campaign of maybe 30, 32 days, but based upon the days I think we were forced into by circumstance, we ended up having a 37-day Kickstarter. And a lot of people, I think, were kind of surprised when they came to the project and that they saw we had 27 days left. They were thinking that it had been going for 3 days rather than 10 days at that point. And so it looked even better than it actually was in their eyes. And you add all of those factors together, the large mailing list, the very large initial boost, getting onto the projects that we love tab and Kickstarter, the impression that we were further along than we should have been because people weren't aware of how many days we actually had in our project. All of it added together to have a very strong pusher momentum from the beginning that we were able to carry pretty far through the end. I was working pretty hard through the project, I would say. Probably 12, 16-hour days every day during the project. Just trying to make the biggest social media presence that we could without being a nuisance. And that's actually more challenging than it sounds, because a lot of social media platforms have an antagonistic relationship to Kickstarter now, and you can kind of reason why that is. People being in the same situation that I was rather, having to really push their project no matter what, and really just make it an overall nuisance of themselves. It became very hard to actually talk about a Kickstarter on Reddit, and you have to sort of talk about it sideways now, where you'll just be sort of posting media, and you'll just, if someone asks about the project, you can post your website, and your website then will have a link to the Kickstarter. And the mods of some Reddits are even wise to that, and they don't really look too kindly upon that. So there's not a lot you can do. We actually had a number of very great Imgur topics, which is something that I hadn't really used in the past. But we had a few that went all the way up to nearly 1 million views. And you can do much better than that even. I actually saw a few recently that were up to 12 million views. But 1 million views is nothing to sneeze at. And when we actually did projections of where we expected to be versus where we actually ended up on the days that those great topics hit, it might have added thousands of dollars to our projections.
I think you've covered pretty much what I was going to ask on my other question too, which is really great because you're really touching on a lot of the pieces that I think people would be interested in hearing with regards to the Kickstarter process. I kept thinking about how grueling that whole process must have been for your team, and I know that I saw you
for me in particular,
really late hours.
I'm pretty much like the sole marketing guy in the project.
Yeah.
Not to take away from Mark, because Mark does incredible work, and he's an amazing partner. Just having someone who puts in steady, responsible hours is more than you can sometimes expect from a small indie partner. And that I really have to hand it to Mark. I mean, for just sticking with it, being stoic, I mean, being very responsible in his thinking at every stage of the project. And he basically just kept things going in the background while I focus on marketing for that 50 days or so. I mean, it really took a toll on me. I'm not going to lie.
Don't worry, Soul. Someday you'll know what it's like to have a partner like that.
Yeah, well, you know.
But yeah, I mean, that was, it wasn't even hell week. It wasn't hell month. It was hell month and 2/3. I mean, I had to spend a good 12, 15 days just decompressing after all of it. I mean, not to go into detail, but I mean, my heart rate was a bit faster than it should have been consistently. I mean, just shock of neurotransmitters. I really had to re-energize after that.
It's understandable.
Mm-hmm.
What were the original platform plans for the game? Was it always intended to be on home consoles, or did you think that it would be like a PC-only game, or what was the original thought?
When you actually start an indie project, it sounds kind of strange, but you don't really do anything if you're doing it right, I think, but focus on just the prototype itself. I mean, we had an idea of what consoles it might fit, might not, but we were just focused on getting a living, sustainable idea, something that we could actually carry forward. And that's not always something you can do with any prototype. I mean, most of them just die in the first couple months. But when it actually became valuable and it looked like something that we could commercially push, we had just said, we're going to put this thing on Steam. And if it does well there, then we'll take it further. And that was more or less where it stood for the longest time. I mean, we had the intention of possibly moving to the Nintendo Switch platform, and we toyed with that. But we didn't really lock that in until very close to the Kickstarter. I mean, we were sort of putting out feelers for what people wanted to see in the projects, and a Nintendo Switch build was the thing that we heard 70% of the time. And after investigating it and finding out that other than obtaining the dev kits, there really aren't too many major hurdles, we more or less said, okay, this is something that we're going to commit to. And then we sort of publicized that from there. And to go back, I think it was actually a bit earlier than the Kickstarter, now that I remember, because I think it was March of 2018 that we actually made that commitment. And we were thinking that the Kickstarter might have been a bit earlier than it was at that point. I think some of the things that delayed it were just the music for the demo that we needed to complete. And the reason why that was important was because we made a very big deal of having a vertical slice demo available for everyone during the Kickstarter to try before we actually started publicizing it. And the reason I think that was very important, there's a lot of Kickstarters that have been made since about 2013, 2014, the golden age of Kickstarter, where, I mean, people have sort of had dollar signs in their eyes, and they didn't really put in the due diligence to really demonstrate they had the actual resources and the actual discipline to go through with finishing the project. I don't want to name any names, but if you think very hard, you can probably think of a few that are still rankling in recent memory. And so having a demo, something that people could get a complete picture of what we were actually asking them to spend money on, I mean, being able to try before they would buy, it was a very important part of actually proving our commitment to the project. And so we didn't actually start pushing toward the Kickstarter until we were completely finished with that demo.
You know how hard, I mean, you kind of said it yourself, how hard the people in the Switch community were pushing for that stretch goal and that physical to happen. But are you at all surprised about how passionate the Switch fans can be, or did you just expected that?
It was sort of half and half. I had some familiarity with the degree to which Nintendo fans can become very zealous. but actually experiencing the community firsthand and directly, rather than just having people actually demand the Switch, but actually going and meeting the people from the community surrounding the Nintendo platform, there was a lot of positive energy. We really had a great experience meeting all of those people. I mean, the Switch Force community, which I think you gentlemen are affiliated with, right?
Switch Core.
Yeah, the Switch Core. That's right. Yeah, sorry. Switch Force is something else, right?
I guess.
I think they're a news aggregate.
Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. The Switch Core. We were very surprised the day we'd actually met that group of people, and it was something like 50, 60, 70 people just showed up out of the woodwork. I mean, it was something like from the movie Hook, where Robin Williams goes and meets Rufio and the Lost Boys. It was
Bangarang.
Bangarang.
Well, it's really something to be said about the passion of the folks that really enjoy the platform, but also we're looking for games like what you're developing. So, what's your favorite stretch goal from the project, and why?
Probably the one that we didn't meet, but I think we have a strong intention of trying to implement it anyway. The randomizer.
Ooh.
And that's actually something they advise you not to do, to chase after trends, because at the point something is a trend, it's already usually too late to get involved with it. I mean, the community will have moved on in the 2 years it actually takes you to finish the project. But I mean, I've actually played randomized run Legend of Zelda a few times. I mean, 3 or 4 times. And I had a ball with it. It was something where I experienced the game almost to the same kind of experience that I had when I first tried it as a 6-year-old. I mean, everything felt new. I mean, the sense of mystery that it had. The randomizer has so much power to invoke those old feelings again. And despite the fact that they tell you not to chase a trend, I think to some extent it might have a timeless quality to it. And so it was something that we were really interested in pursuing, even though it didn't materialize as a stretch goal.
As a huge proponent of speedrunning, I can tell you that randomizer is definitely a very welcome feature. I've been so to test. I have been complaining that Nintendo needed to add in randomizer stuff into the Nintendo Switch Online app. I was like, if they do a Legend of Zelda SP, they should just make it a randomizer. It'd be perfect. It'd be the perfect thing to do. But I'm all for that. That's great.
I mean, there's really 2 things I think the community is demanding from Nintendo. They want a randomizer in a Zelda game, and they want a Zelda maker in the vein of a Mario maker. And I mean, there's various reasons I think for especially why the second doesn't exist. But I mean, that's again one of these really low-hanging fruits that for whatever reason Nintendo refuses to fulfill. And I think we really hit an opportunity there to give the community something they really demand.
Yeah, the makers, there's actually a standalone Mega Man maker that came out that was independently developed, and that was wonderful. But I'll get back on track here, Saul. I'm sorry. Let's see. Did
you hear that whip crack? Did you hear that whip crack?
Do you know who's going to be handling your publishing for you? Is it going to be self-published, or do you have like a small run company coming up? Or
well, we have a company lined up to handle the actual physical manufacturing, and we can't really say due to NDA.
Sure.
I don't like saying that too often, but this is one where we really can't say.
Oh, we understand. We understand. I think what we're really looking for is just tell us.
Yeah. But yeah, the other side of the question, just a publisher in general. As an indie, I think you really have to be careful with that, because getting involved with a publisher too early can put too many strings on the project. It can kind of put you into some creative binds when they start putting creative pressure onto the projects. They start putting parameters onto it I mean, you have the vision to create a 20-hour game, but they, for whatever reason, want a 5-hour game, and you just end up making all of these compromises. And there's a lot that a publisher can provide in terms of good marketing, I mean, resources. But at the point of development that we're in right now, I think that we're trying to stay publisher free, at least until the point where we have the game nearly finished. And from that point, we'll actually look at our options and see if it benefits us to take on a publisher from that point, I think.
Are there going to be any pack-in items, posters, keychains, manuals, or anything you can give us any information on?
Well, we absolutely have a manual. We've committed to that. So that's actually going to be printed up with the physical item. But other than that, we've really tried to stay pretty low on the physicals because we know it's something that's hurt a lot of Kickstarters in the past. I mean, there's all sorts of logistic issues that you get into when you're trying to source them and ship them internationally. And it can take a much bigger bite of your funding than you think it will. Something that we did offer, we have PDF-based sheet music that we're offering as a digital. But then for people past the $250 mark, our guest composer, Hiroki Kikuta, is actually going to be signing the physical copies of that. And so that's a real treat for the few people who were able to nab up that. I think that was only about 25 or 30 people, though.
You had a special surprise announced with Dawnthorn, and a bonus 8-bit style RPG, right? Mm-hmm. I got this is kind of a two-part question. What made you decide to do this? And then did you happen to draw any inspiration from when Bloodstain did Curse of the Moon?
Believe it or not, it was completely independent of that project. It wasn't even in our mind. I wasn't even aware they did it. So we thought of the idea independently. I think Dawnthorn started sometime around June, July of 2018. And basically the concept was we were in a period of development where we were focusing on the dungeon items of the game. And we had a pretty good set up to that point, but we're always trying to play around with prototypes for new items. I mean, we're trying on, what if we have a laser that shoots an electrical ball that has some sort of puzzle facet to it and has some sort of combat facet. And we're always trying to come up with these new item ideas. And I mean, we had been through like 30 or 40 of these things. And the sense of fatigue had really started to set in, where we were saying, okay, we need to take some time out and just put this thing on the back burner for just a bit and give it a rest. And one of the things that we came up with as an idea for how to do that was we went back to the original design document for what Hazelnut Bastille was meant to be. We went back to that concept of like a 2 or 3 month project. And we said, why don't we just take a month and a half out and start working on that and just get our minds clear. And it'll allow us to do a number of things at once. It'll give us some experience with commercial publishing ahead of Hazelnut's release, which I think will be invaluable when we actually get to release Dawnthorn. It will give us the chance to have the same engine that Hazelnut is being built with, because more or less they're the same engine in Unity that we've adapted for other projects. And we'll be able to, I mean, we've been testing the engine for the last year, but testing it with 1,000 people versus testing it with 20,000 people is a whole different situation. So having the experience of having the engine in the hands of that many people at once and being able to work out all of the kinks at once, I think will make the Hazelnut release that much smoother. And so there's that aspect.
Just do me a big favor, make it an unlockable on the Switch version, something that you could unlock on.
People are demanding that.
That would be fantastic.
Well, why don't I talk about that now? So people have suggested that we combine the two of those onto one disc. And I don't want to make a statement here because, I mean, people will find this recording. They will watch this show. And we're going to be hearing about it for the next 2 years if I say something here. So I can't commit to that. but it's something we're going to try, at least for the limited edition physical copy that we're actually offering the people from the Kickstarter. And it might have some relationship to Hazelnut in the game, but we'll see how that materializes. I mean,
it'll be great to find out what comes of that, though.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we're just thinking we're going to release it on Steam. We'll see how it does there, and if it does well, there's a good shot you'll actually see it on the Switch platform as well, and maybe even the PS4. I mean, we'll see how it does. We have pretty high hopes for it.
So do we. I'm gonna let you pump something else here for a second. We're still on Hazelnut Bastille, but the Aloft Studio Discord is nicely active. You know, I've been there for quite a while now. There always seems to be some sort of discussion about art direction or game theory going on. How in the vein of that, how settled are you and your team with the direction of Hazelnut Bastille so far? I mean, are you strong on that? You feel good with where you're at?
We feel pretty good about the core of the game itself in terms of the character controller, the concept of what the game is. The story is set in stone, and we've developed the NPCs pretty far. We have the major mechanics pretty well developed. I mean, a big part of the Hazelnut projects is getting design feedback, and that's something that's really shaped the project from the beginning. We had the prototype in the hands of the community, I think just 2 or 3 months into development. And it's really made a positive impact on the game so far. And one of the things that we've committed to due to the Kickstarter, it is offering people, I think it was at the $40 level, the chance to continue in that process as alpha testers, is what we're calling it. And that they'll continue giving design feedback at every major step of the way. And we're actually going to be offering a session with Dawnthorn pretty soon, where the people who paid for that tier will be able to jump in and test out all of the game items, test out the character controller and the enemy set that we currently have. And we'll get some feedback there. I mean, because you kind of want to have like a coherent picture between the relationship of your major combat items, how your enemies interact with the character, and how it relates to the growth of the character in the sense of being a Metroidvania over time. And you can kind of judge some of that as a developer. I mean, you sort of get an eye for that, but putting it into the hands of fans and players, I think gives you the next level of understanding of how people interact with the products.
You've kind of touched on some of the other projects that you have that you talked about bringing to life after Hazelnut Bastille. So I'll just move on to the second part of this question was,
Sure.
Are you planning on taking a nice break after Hazelnut Bastille comes out, or?
I might take a break for maybe 2 months, 4 months, something like that. I mean, maybe do some traveling internationally. I mean, I've seen a big part of Europe during my lifetime, but I haven't gotten the chance to see Asia yet. And I'd like some time to maybe visit Japan and Thailand, maybe the mainland China, Taiwan. I mean, that'd be interesting. But
you'll pick up some inspiration, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
You pick up some dirt cheap NES games.
Yeah, sure. I mean, at the same time, I think people really underestimate the degree to which, as a game developer, doing something like this is really our deep life passion, and you kind of feel like you're missing part of your life when you're not doing development for more than a month, and so even if it's our intention to spend all of that time, I mean, having some R&R, I think I'm going to be pushing myself right back into a development project, whether I like it or not. I mean, it's kind of a part of me at this point.
So Hazelnut Bastille is an open story, so a direct sequel could be possible someday, or is there just going to be a satisfying conclusion that's going to enable you to move on and focus on other projects?
So Hazelnut and Dawnthorn have a pretty close relationship. There's a character in the story of Hazelnut Bastille that you kind of meet in a tangential way, and you don't learn very much about this character through the course of Hazelnut, but his entire story is told through the course of Dawnthorn. And so in that sense, there is an extended universe, and at least in the sense that it encompasses those two games. But at the same time, the ending of Hazelnut, as we currently conceive it, has a lot of finality to it for a lot of reasons. And so it will probably be a project that's more or less closed between those two games. I don't picture there being another game in that universe. I mean, it's possible, but I think we're going to move on to other projects after that.
The Smash Brothers version of Hazelnut Bastille.
The Blade Strangers. Blade
Strangers. That, yeah, exactly. Hazelnut Bastille Kart.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, a kart racer. That'd be good.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
We don't have too many of those on Switch.
Yeah, there's only like 8 on the Switch right now. Room for plenty more.
So that kind of takes care of all the main questions we have. We generally keep it to around 20 or so questions. A little bit more, a little bit less. But at the end of our interviews, we always have a bonus question. And the bonus question can be kind of topical with the interview that we're doing, but it usually doesn't have anything to do with the game or the development of games or anything in particular. It's kind of just like an off-the-wall question. So
yes,
for you, the question we came up with was, if you were going to design a themed drink around the game and call it a Hazelnut Bastille, what would the base of the drink be, and what would the final taste be described as?
I did not see this coming.
You're not the first person to go silent after we've asked these questions. So
let's see. I mean, what am I even gonna say, man? So okay, so you definitely have to have some ground up hazelnut in there. I mean that's a given. What would accompany hazelnut? I mean, maybe like a smooth, creamy matcha, maybe a little bit of a raspberry flavor. I mean, let's see. I mean, given that it's Anatolia, I mean, maybe something else, a little Turkish to throw in there. I mean, some sort of aperitif layer, maybe. So
I'm thinking he's already thought this out. Is really what it is.
He's playing coy. He knows what's going on.
He's already started to write the menu on this stuff.
There's your pack-in item. You just make a little cue card that has the Hazelnut Bastille drink formula on there and pack that in.
See, that's where there needs to be an OTS bar in the game that serves the drink. That's all I'm saying.
One of these days we'll get featured in a game. Don't you worry, Sol.
I'm working on it. I'm going to keep pushing for this. Well, Dennis, I wanted to give you one last chance here before we kind of wrap things up to just anything that you want to share with anybody. If you got any special tidbits, any shout outs, anything you want to mention to the listeners, the fans, that type of thing. It's an open forum right now. You're able to talk about whatever you want here.
You can pip your social medias if you want to.
That's right.
Honestly, we're just kind of keeping our heads down at this point. we're trying to put our nose to the grindstone, really. I mean, there's not a whole lot to say. I mean, we don't have any huge announcements coming on. I mean, we're just trying to keep grinding and plugging along. I mean, it's kind of anticlimactic for this slot. I apologize.
No, it's great. I mean, I think all of the people that have backed the project that are very much looking forward to it, and even those that were watching that maybe they couldn't back the project at the time, that are kind of anticipating a physical release and hoping that they can jump on board after the fact.
Right.
You know, I think they're all probably really anxious to see you get that product out there, because it's super promising. I mean, everything that I've seen, it's a beautiful looking product. The game is the artwork is amazing. The feel is very Zelda-like, but with its own flavor, its own style, right? Something that still screams, you know, that it's its own thing, but with this hint of, if you liked the Zelda product, you're probably gonna like this too. So that's what I'm reading from it.
Yeah, you just reminded me of one thing. We had the plan to open up late backing sometime early in January, and obviously that hasn't materialized yet. But I mean, we have a few business prereqs right now that we're sorting out to make that possible. And that's something I don't want to set a date for, but I mean, that should be somewhat imminent at this point. People who didn't get a chance to back during the Kickstarter itself will have another shot at least some of the tiers. And we do plan to be offering the physical copy to people for a very long time to come, and for the normal price that we had during the Kickstarter. So you will be able to get in on that. And that's not slightly motivated by the very high mandatory minimums that you have to actually manufacturing the PlayStation 4 and the Nintendo Switch copies. So I mean, we'll have to boost our numbers somewhat through sales of the physicals through development, I think. So stay tuned.
I don't
for
think
that.
you're going to have any problem selling those once people see it. You're going to do just fine.
Yeah, I'm pretty comfortable about how things are going. I think we'll be pretty safe.
Well, I got to tell you, it's been a great pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for spending some time with us on the shelf. And we would love to have you on at some point in the future. Maybe when you guys are about ready to release, maybe we could have you back on for a little bit.
Sure. I mean, maybe we can hop in for the release of Dawnthorn, maybe. I mean,
that'd be wonderful.
Projected for this spring sometime. So that's something
we
we'll
would love to have you here. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Dennis, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks for putting in the due diligence to wrestle my arm back and get me on the show.
We've been looking forward to it. We think it's great what you're doing. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.